You don't have to be around Plymouth Church for very long to discover that Stoddard Lane is an important figure in our history. His portrait is prominently displayed in a well-traveled hallway, and next to it is the Plymouth motto, "We agree to differ, we resolve to love, we unite to serve." We attribute these words to Lane, although it is doubtful that they are original to him. He did recognize their appropriateness to the spirit of Plymouth Church. He applied them to Plymouth in a sermon, and so lifted them up for subsequent generations to celebrate. In part because he died in office, Stoddard Lane has come to be enshrouded in Plymouth mythology. But the truth about him, as reflected in his writings, drawn from contemporary news sources and gleaned from the recollections of those who knew him, is every bit as compelling as the myth, perhaps even more so. He was born in Unionville, Connecticut, and raised in Mount Vernon, New York, where his father was a Presbyterian minister for 21 years. Unlike his predecessor, A.L. Frisbee, there is no indication that Lane's childhood was anything but happy. It certainly did not foster the spirit of rebellion that we see on the part of some preachers' kids. In fact, Stoddard's brother George and sister Laura also became ordained ministers. His educational background was excellent. Like Frisbee, Lane was a graduate of Amherst College with a B.A. in 1909 and an M.A. in 1910. His B.D., or Bachelor of Divinity degree, later this degree would more appropriately be called a Master of Divinity, was from Hartford Theological Seminary in 1913, the same school from which Alden Hebert would later graduate. Following seminary, Lane pursued graduate studies at the University of Berlin in 1914. Many years later, while he was serving at Plymouth Church, Lane would be awarded the honorary degree of Doctor of Divinity, or D.D., also from Amherst. Lane came to Plymouth Church with a wealth of experience, both professional and personal. He served as an associate minister at the Church of the Pilgrims in Brooklyn, New York for a few months, probably something like an internship. Then he became minister of the Community Church of Bogota, New Jersey, from 1915 to 1923. During this pastorate, he took a leave of absence for 19 months, beginning in 1917, during which time he served in the U.S. Army Ambulance Service with the French Army. We'll say more about this in just a little while, but clearly this experience during World War I had a profound influence on the rest of his life. Stoddard Lane returned to the Bogota Church and served there until 1923. Then he was called to the First Congregational Church of Manchester, New Hampshire, from 1923 to 1929. He began at Plymouth on October 10, 1929. His partner in life and in ministry at Plymouth was Estella Hitchcock Lane. Stella, as she was known, was born in Holyoke, Massachusetts. She was raised in West Hartford, Connecticut. She was actually Lane's second wife. A writer and educator, she was already a published author when the Lanes came to Des Moines. Her collection of children's stories, The Come True Land Stories, was published in 1929. Stoddard and Stella were married on June 22, 1920. There were 4 Lane children. Stoddard Jr. was born on July 23, 1916, in New Jersey, to Stoddard and his first wife, Anna Hepburn Lane, who died giving birth to their son, leaving the young pastor, he'd been there only a year, to grieve and to deal on his own with a baby. It was only a year later that Lane left his young son with relatives and went to France to serve in the ambulance corps. The more we know about this story, the more we would like to know. What was Stoddard Lane's frame of mind when he left his congregation and his son to go to France? We know that he was a person of high principles who was willing to sacrifice for his convictions. But what role did his grief play in this decision? We just don't know. Whatever the case, he had plenty to think about as he experienced firsthand the horrors of war. It changed him forever, and members of his family were convinced that it shortened his life. To return to the Lane children, Stoddard Jr. died on February 26, 1989. Barbara Hitchcock Lane was born in 1923 and died in 1994. And two Lane daughters are still living. Lori Ruth Lane Redeker, born in 1926, and Mary Dana Lane Webster, born just before the family came to Des Moines on July 29th of 1929. Alden Hebbard has corresponded with these two Lane daughters, and we'll hear from them in a moment. The Plymouth Church to which Lane came in October of 1929 was filled with promise. There was a new state-of-the-art facility at 42nd and Ingersoll, the sanctuary having been dedicated less than 2 years earlier. The complicated political machinations of joining three congregations, Plymouth, Greenwood, and Waveland Park, had been successfully accomplished during the pastorate of Lane's predecessor, Bertus McCatton. Indications are that there was a fairly well-unified congregation. Plymouth had made a significant commitment to a growing educational ministry, having hired for the first time a full-time paid Christian educator. Almost certainly, congregational memory was safely beyond the Frisbee era. Mrs. Frisbee was still around and visible at important occasions, such as the dedication of the sanctuary in 1927, but her presence did little to shape expectations of the new pastor. And McCatton had retired and moved to England, well beyond meddling range. At that time, the world was still a fairly optimistic place. After the end of World War I, there was hope for progress and world peace. The still fairly young 20th century had been termed the Christian century, because advances in transportation and communication would make it possible to share the gospel with the whole world. But the ministry Lane ended up conducting was much more challenging than might have been expected. The stock market crashed in October 1929, the very month the Lanes arrived in Des Moines, foreshadowing the Great Depression. In short order, the Plymouth budget was curtailed. By 1933, Stella Lane had become the unpaid director of the church school, a position she held until 1939. She and Stoddard teamed up on children's stories. She wrote them, and he delivered them to the delight of children and adults. 21 of these Des Moines stories were gathered into a book, The Giant Who Liked Chocolate Cake, that was published in 1939. And of course, all during Lane's ministry, the world was moving toward war. Most vexing were the church's severe financial struggles. There are letters in the archives from the trustees to the counties to whom the church was indebted for the land and the community house that sat on it. The church was unable to meet its obligations, so the debt was restructured to allow for a more protracted payment schedule at a reduced interest rate, but then the church was unable to meet even the revised payments. It was a grim time. But through it all, Plymouth Church carried on a very active program within the church and in the community of Des Moines. and Stoddard Lane came to be recognized as an outstanding preacher of great intellect and integrity. Our history class read together two of Lane's sermons, one from 1936 entitled "The Main Business of Religion," in which Lane argues that any responsible practice of Christianity requires active engagement with issues of economic justice. The other sermon we read was one of Lane's annual Armistice Day sermons, this from 1941. Like Harry Emerson Fosdick and other progressive preachers of that era, Lane would never again endorse war as an instrument for bringing about a world of peace. That pacifist position, of course, was a matter of some controversy in Des Moines. Stoddard Lane's core convictions were not difficult to express. Loving God, the worth and dignity of every human being, our mutual obligation to one another, these were the essential elements, according to his daughter Lori Lane Redeker. And Rabbi Eugene Mannheimer, Lane's close friend and colleague from Temple B'nai Jeshurun, spoke warmly of Lane's true and deep love of God that found the fullest expression in his true and deep love of his fellow men. Love of God and neighbor, of course, is how Jesus chose to sum up the entire Judeo-Christian tradition, and Lane embodied it to those who knew him well. But it was how he carried those convictions that was particularly endearing and impressive, especially to those with whom Lane respectfully disagreed. He didn't take himself seriously. A warm sense of humor is evident in his sermons. There was not a scrap of hubris or pomposity in him, said his daughter Lori Lane Redeker. He obviously was an excellent pastor. He was a good listener, patient with everybody, including his family, recalls daughter Mary Lane Webster. Stoddard Lane was an ardent opponent of injustice, and he had a wonderful ecumenical spirit, inclusive and welcoming to people of a variety of faiths. Daughter Lori recalls that one of the things that drew him to Des Moines was the lack of prejudice among the people. He said their open-mindedness enabled him to accomplish more in the field of social action in a year in Iowa than he could in 10 years back east. Stoddard Lane would seek spiritual renewal and refreshment during the summers, sailing in Maine. A memorial stained glass window in the Plymouth sanctuary features a sailboat. Here is a picture of Mere Point, near where Lane used to sail. He stayed at Plymouth longer than had many of his predecessors. In large part that was because of his love for the church and the work. His daughter recounts that during the years he was at Plymouth, he received many urgent and tempting offers to forsake it for churches that paid more and were closer to his beloved summer retreat in Maine. But he loved the church, the people, the community of Des Moines, and the work there that meant so much to him. Monday was Stoddard Lane's day off. Lori remembers that he was at home one Monday when the mail arrived with his paycheck. He remarked, "It seems wrong to be getting paid for doing what I would rather be doing than anything else in the world." And if Lane loved Plymouth, the church certainly reciprocated. They held a major celebration of the 10th anniversary of his pastorate, the program from which remains in the archives. His departure from the Plymouth pulpit was sudden and unexpected. Stoddard Lane preached for the last time on January 17, 1943. Shortly thereafter he was taken ill, I believe with a stroke, and he died on May 17th. His funeral sermon was preached by Dr. John Milton Phillips, the senior minister of First Central Congregational Church of Omaha. Lane's Plymouth legacy is a rich one. He is remembered for the Plymouth motto. He was a founding member of the local chapter of the National Conference of Christians and Jews. He showed tremendous moral courage in preaching pacifism during the years leading up to World War II. And after that conflict was engaged, he devoted his energies to trying to envision a post-war world in which the mistakes made after World War I would not be repeated. Stella's children's stories are still fondly remembered by some of our members, and most importantly, he was the beloved pastor of Plymouth Church during a crucial period in history, from the Great Depression and into World War II. And with the passage of time, his legacy grows, as his remarkable words and indomitable spirit continue to be a part of our common life at Plymouth Church. Truly, Stoddard Lane was exactly what he was remembered to be. He is the King David figure of the 20th century.